Carol, I would like to start with a map to start that my father and his family lived, and my mother's family lived in 5 countries, but never left town. So this is the map of Hungary in 1944, and it's Carpathia. It has Munkacs, it has Ungvar, which was the capital of Carpathia, Hust, and Bilke. Bilke is the town where my grandmother, on my father's side, the family was born. And we have some books published, and that's where I was able to get more information about my family. So living in one country, living in one house, but not living, living in 5 countries meant that,
Fuck you.
Kevin, we can hear you. Mute, please. Anyway, they lived in lived in Carpathia, and it was part Austro-Hungarian Empire, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Germany, Russia, Ukraine. My my father and his siblings, they all spoke 5, 6 languages. So just this is the background that I missed saying last 2 weeks ago. Again, these are the cities that the famous, beautiful city. They had yeshivas, they had cultural life, theater, music, synagogue. And what I research is about Hungary in those years that it said during this period, the Hungarian Jewish population in Budapest and other large cities of central Hungary was largely middle class, a highly cultured people in a country with landed aristocracy and large peasantry. At Budapest, Dohany Synagogue was once the largest synagogue in Europe. So the Jews were very comfortable and financially well off, and services were conducted in a synagogue in Hungarian. By 1930s, Jews made up 20% of Budapest population. Yet, in the course of a matter of 1 decade, the golden age turned into a nightmare. That's when anti-Semitism started in 1939, 1940, and Jews weren't allowed to own property and own businesses. That's part of still before Second World War. And our life, again, the borders closed after the war was over. My parents went back to Europe. Most of our relatives stayed either in Germany or Czechoslovakia, and they applied to come to United States. They didn't want to go back to their old area, and they didn't want to be Hungarian, and they remembered the anti-Semitism. But my parents went back to the old home where they lived, and they started a new life. They had no choice. The Russians closed the border, as I mentioned to you. One of my cousins that I want to mention, who lived in Czechoslovakia, was Alex and Adolf Klein and Blanche Brown with her husband and their daughter. My cousin Myra was born in Czechoslovakia. They waited 5 years to come to this country. And her mom and my mom corresponded, and we tremendously appreciated getting a letter from United States with having the Statue of Liberty stamp on it. It gave us hope, and we were hoping at some point to reunite with the families. But there was no Russia. The laws were such in Russia that you cannot leave. You have to be sponsored, and of course, as you know, I mentioned last time, there was we were 3 times refused to travel to Israel, where my father's brother and sister survived the war in Budapest lived. So what happened is in August in 1975, after we already came to this country, they signed a Helsinki. The different governments joined and signed the Helsinki Final Act, including reunification of families separated during and after Second World War. This was several act signs, And one was the human rights, including freedom of immigration and reunification of families from Eastern Europe. The Helsinki monitoring group was set up to watch human rights because just like now happening in Belarus, uh, people who want to be free, they're being right now, as we speak, imprisoned for their freedom. And so the human rights group from Helsinki was monitoring that the Russian Jews would not be imprisoned just because they want to be free and they want to leave the country. So Nathan Shransky, if any of you heard about him, he was one of those who was imprisoned. His wife Avital came to this country and helped, traveled through the whole United States and Israel to help free him. He's now part of the Israeli government. Well known, he speaks often on Shalom TV. What also happened in 1972 to January 75, the Congress of the United States debated and added the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Reform Act, which restricted the president's ability to provide most favored nation to the Soviet Union and other not marked economy that formed the Soviet bloc. The timing and provision of the amendment reflect the presidential ambition and distrust of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union allowed a number of Soviet Jews to emigrate after the 1967 war in Israel, which that was us, in 1968, they allowed us to leave. We were one of the first families to allow to leave Russia. Expectations of freer immigration were raised, but they were soon shattered. In 1972, Soviet immigration had tax-made immigration very difficult. If somebody attended college, you had to pay back. If you lived in Russia so many years, they taxed the Russian Jews. This Soviet edict levied an additional exit tax on education immigrants, which appeared to have the effect of singled out Jews most heavily. The education tax imposed in 1972 in Moscow summit, superpower leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev embodied those criticized the Nixon administration policy of detente. So at first, Jackson organized the political movement to link trade, which in one of the articles that we were interviewed, I mentioned that we were traded for wheat, and that's how the Russians agreed with United States, sell us wheat, and we let some of the Jews to leave. So the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in the summer of 72 introduced it to 92nd Congress in October 1972. Jackson efforts rooted in his own domestic political calculations and ideological distrust of the antipathy toward the Soviet Union complicated the Nixon White House pursuit of detente, which had worked on since '69. However, 3/4 of the Senate co-sponsored the amendment, neutralizing opposition from President Nixon. And in 1975, President Ford signed the amendment. So that's when all the Russian Jews came as refugees. By passing that law, it opened the doors to this country. The door wasn't open often. As you know, the story of St. Louis after the war, the ship was not allowed to come to this country, and many Jews were sent back to Europe and died. So to leave Europe when, like my grandparents, both have businesses, they didn't know about life in this country. So they chose up until 1930s, 40 to stay back because they had married children, they had grandchildren, and they had what to live from. They had businesses. My grandmothers on my father's side, they had leather business. All the children, my great grandfather opened leather business in different towns for each child who got married. And my grandfather on my mother's side, they had farm and they had a store in their house. So they were able to make a living, and they didn't know what to expect to come to this country. But it wasn't easy to come here. The doors weren't open. So I just want to reflect a little bit more about our life, how we celebrated holidays. And it wasn't easy. My mother was able to get candles, and she was a believer and enjoyed celebrating Shabbat with us. And so we had Shabbat table set, and she had candles to light. And she prepared and baked challah and delicious Shabbat meal. But when it came to like Hanukkah, we did not celebrate it the same way as in this country. We did not have menorah, and we did not have Hanukkah candles. What they had is an oil lamp that I could recall, and we played with walnuts. I don't know if you're familiar, this generation, but the walnuts in a shell, we would set it up on a table, 8 walnuts, and we would play with them, and who got better numbers of, knocking the walnuts, or like bowling, we would get some money, and that was like our Hanukkah game and celebration. But what we enjoyed most is of my mother making sufganiot, the donuts, and that was part of our Hanukkah celebration. After Hanukkah was the holiday of Purim, and I think my friends will remember it. We would get dressed in costumes as like our mother's clothes, put on kerchief, and when the outside got dark, we would go visit each other and have fun, just running around and being silly. But at one point, I don't know if, again, my friends remember, one of our teachers were walking also on a sidewalk near us, and he grabbed one of our hands and says, "What are you doing? Who are you?" And he was quite drunk. He was, I'm not sure if he completely recognizes, but he realized that this was something strange to him, that we were dressed like in sloppy clothes and costumes. And so thank God we would not called into the principal's office that we did something wrong. And that's how we celebrated Purim. Our mothers baked these like 9-inch from bread dough homentashes, and it was filled with lekvar and delicious triangle, and then we would cut it into smaller pieces. This was our homemade homentashen. I talked about Passover already, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the next holiday that we enjoyed and celebrated is the Shavuos with flowers, which I forgot to bring in today. But we always had green branches hanging in a room, and that was the symbol of freedom. And the milk and honey, my mother baked the most delicious pastries, the cheesecakes, cheese triangle shaped and square cheese pastries, and blintzes. So this is how it's all in me and stayed with me. I enjoyed cooking with my mother and baking, and we shared and we visited friends, and that's how we celebrated. On high holidays, my mother again baked challah, round challah, and her specialty was honey cookies that you small cookies, and she covered it with egg white, and then she would uh, put a piece of walnut on it before baking, and that was her honey cookie. My parents went to services at an elder couple's house where they had a Torah, and this gentleman was not working anymore. He was older, and so he took he risked his life by having service in his house. But somehow on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, my parents were able to do that. They fasted on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, I remember. And when they would come home, we would be home with my brother. And when they would come home, we would have some warm drink and schnapps, and they would have the honey cookie and some other food after fasting all day. Uh, to to have like the lekvar, I wanted to mention that in our yard, and most of everybody had fruit trees, and what was popular in our area is the grapes. Carpathia was well known for having the best grapes. Everybody had lots of grapes growing in their yard. And we had plum trees. And from this plum tree, in a fall, they cooked in these large pots outside, like a bonfire. They cooked the plums to make the prune lekvar, it's called, which you can still buy here in the supermarket. And so they saved that for the winter. And some of them, they saved them in jars. Everything had to be planned for the winter meals. And what else they do? They also they would come. The Russians would come all the way from around Kiev and everywhere to purchase in trucks all this plum. So they sold them, and they also make slivovica. If anybody remember that drink, slivovica is alcohol, and they made wine out of the grapes, and that's how we were able to have wine for holidays and Passover. I'd like to acknowledge again my cousin from Israel and just a little bit talk about him, that he's the one who came to pick us up at the airport when we arrived. And I'm very close with Kevin, who's served in the army after we came to this country. He went to Israel and he served in the army. I'm very proud of him. And his children both served recently in the Israeli army. Tal still, the daughter, still in the army. And my cousin Louis Berkowitz is also very dedicated to Israel. And he likes to study with rabbis here and in Israel. So I'm very happy about that. And I don't know, Carol, you have the pictures. Some of my cousins' pictures I have. Again, my cousin Myra, whose mom corresponded with my mother, and they sent packages. This is my son David's bar mitzvah invitation. I was going to share with you this. His bar mitzvah was Hanukkah, and a friend designed this invitation. And this was happy time in this country after we arrived, when we celebrated. And these are my mother's cousins and family, and they're seldom working, sitting there, and my uncle and my mother's cousins. So we were happy to come and appreciate and treasure that we were able to celebrate such a happy occasion. And at that time, we had these wonderful relatives. Thank you, Carol. These are cousins also. I don't know if any of you remember Alex Klein with his wife, and Eva Klein and Blanche Brown, Gloria Semovitz, Volkov. Alex and Adolf Klein were my mother's first cousins, and they owned the Broadway diner and mainline diner. If any of you used to have breakfast or lunch at the diner, mainline diner is Main Street, used to be, and the Broadway diner on Fairfield Avenue. And my mother's cousin Blanche owned the fabric store on Fairfield Avenue near Broad Street, that area of downtown Bridgeport. Thank you. And this is my cousin Myra, who I keep in touch regularly also, and we wish each other Shabbat Shalom every Friday, and I'm so lucky to have them, and they live in Virginia, and I'm grateful for all they did for us when I was growing up. We had no clothing store, and her mom would travel to Hartford and ship to us a package every spring, so we would have some new clothes for the summer or holidays. Thank you. This was my daughter Diane's bat mitzvah picture. And these are also relatives. It was David's wedding, and my mother was, thank God, still there. She passed away 3 months later, and it was difficult times. This was a very happy occasion, but in the next 3 months, we lost 3 relatives. In October, cousin Eva, who I loved, I was very close, and She was very good to me when we arrived here. She passed away, and after that, Mary Jacobs, Bernie's mother. So, my mother, all three within 3 months of each other, we lost them. Thank you. This is a picture of Diane, our daughter, who was at that time like about 3 years old. And she was in a nursery school in Rodov Sholom. She loved the nursery school. They were playing outside in the sandbox, and a Connecticut Post writer was walking by, and he took a picture of her, called her Chef Surprise. 3-year-old Diane Cohen seems to know that a watch pot never boils, and she stirred the pretended cooking. So you can see at this age already, she loved to cook, and she still loves to cook, just like my mother. And they prefer not to go out to eat, and everything healthy cooking at home. Thank you, Carol. And this is Diane's daughter, Maya, who's very talented artist. One of the school projects that she did was this owl, the hoot. It says no homework was a hoot, and she and her brother together painted this painting. It's the hoot is the scout for their school, and so this is the school emblem, I think, something like that. Thank you. This was our last year Hanukkah celebration. We were so happy together. As you know, this is a very difficult year. So we were, first time, they wanted to, Maya and the girls and my daughter and daughter-in-law, they wanted to learn to do, make sufganiyot. And so that was our project for Hanukkah. And the children enjoyed watching how they dough rise and cook them in the oil. The donuts, Israeli donuts. Thank you. So this is the part of the preparing the donut on a cloth. We were cutting them out, and we had wonderful time. And I am so grateful that we had this experience last year. I don't know what's going to be this year, but we hope for the best and pray for everybody to stay well. And I hope we're going to be together with the children and the family. But it was fun making donuts with the children. I didn't mention last 2 weeks ago that this is my whole family again, and my brother had 2 children. So my mother had 4 grandchildren. Unfortunately, my nephew passed away too young. At age 22, he had incurable cancer. We miss him. He was like a younger brother to Diane and David. They loved him so dearly. We all loved him. Thank you. So I don't know how we are time-wise, Carol.
We could start questions if you would like. What I'm going to say to you is I'm not so sure there is anybody in Bridgeport to whom you're not related.
Well, I'm so happy. Unfortunately, we don't have too many cousins at this point. That generation is deceased. Many of my mother's cousins and my uncle and aunt. But we treasure and so happy to live in this country and to have these relatives and celebrate. And like life is, as I mentioned, there's good things and unfortunately bad things. But I have a wonderful husband who was a good son-in-law. I don't know, there's one picture not there, I think, Carol, that's the whole family together, but missing maybe. We were good son-in-law and good father and good husband, and I'm very lucky, thank God. And I love Radok Shalom, and I love attending services, and my parents also love Raduk Shalom and participate in all the services.
So I have a co-host here, Cantor Naima. Could you get this back for me so I see everybody's faces for when we're going to have people ask questions? I'm not sure how to do this, and I'm learning. Let's see if I can do it.
Okay, while you're waiting, I just want to mention one movie. I don't know if you're familiar. My parents love to read, and Dr. Zhivago is one of my favorite films. I hope you watched it. That's a reflection of how the Russian life was before Second World War. And Boris Pasternak was a very famous author in Russia, but he could not publish any of his books. So in 1957, his book, the Dr. Zhivago story, was published in Italy. And I think it's a wonderful film.
Okay, thank you. And I managed to figure that out. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Erica, that was really very interesting. It's obvious how much family meant to you then and now. And
Right.
I think that's most admirable as to how close you still are, even to this day, around the world. So I'm going to ask that if anybody has questions, and I know some of you do, questions, comments, maybe you lived in the same area where Erica's family lived, and we'd like to hear that as well. So I'll just ask you, if you raise your hand like in school, and then ask you to unmute when I call on you so we don't have conflicting conversations. So questions. Marion? No, you were just, okay. Bob Markowitz, I know you had a question. So you could unmute, please.
Okay, I unmuted. Erica, why did your parents not go to the DP camps, in Germany after the concentration camps, like a lot of the Jews did?
Right. So they weren't the only one. There were several hundred or thousand people through Carpathia who went back to their homes and hoping that they could find other relatives who survived. So this was, my mother didn't get out of Bergen-Belsen not till July. She was hospitalized after she survived the war. And she was alone. And she had one sister who survived with her. But they went back. They were hoping maybe another brother, maybe another sister, or somebody survived. That was my mother's explanation. But the cousins who stayed in Czechoslovakia, Adolf, Alex, may they rest in peace, and Blanche, Alex was traveling back to Carpathia even when the borders closed, but he was able to snuck in somehow through the border. And he would say to my mother, come. And they didn't want to impose on relatives, and they didn't know what life was here. And they stayed. They whole group of them, men, women, and then they just got married. That was the story that I heard.
Because my
Right.
mother-in-law was at Auschwitz, and
Right.
she tells a story of running through the woods barefoot to escape from. I'm not sure it was the Russians that liberated Auschwitz or the Americans, but they went back to their in Hungary. They went back to Budapest, and to find that their family, they thought their family would be there. They said they were all killed, so they wound up going to the DP camps in Germany. That's where she met my father-in-law.
Of course, I have so many friends. One of them is Goldie. She's probably on. She was born in the Aschwege, DP camp. No, I'm sorry, I forgot the DP camp Goldie. But yes, they were there for 4 or 5 years waiting to come to this country or to Israel. I'm aware of, and lots of, like Goldie was born in the DP camp, and so many other,
And,
young people.
They limited the immigration to the U.S. too, because my mother-in-law had to go to Montreal. She couldn't get into the U.S., but her sister got into New York. She landed in New York. So there was the immigration was difficult. Was difficult for the Jews.
It was very difficult before the war, after the war, and even now. As a matter of fact, I don't have in my hand my passport. I was going to show you my ticket. We flew here on Pan Am Airline, and in my passport it says that we came into this country under Czechoslovakian quota. So there was quotas. There's always been quota how many people allowed to come into this country. Not until this Jackson Amendment, where the Russians were coming millions as refugees. So that law passed, and that's when the door opened, which was in the 80s and 1990s. But before, it was always quota.
Correct. After the war, they limited the adults, but like my wife's uncle came in as a juvenile, and he was 10 years older. So he couldn't even get Social Security until he was 75 years old.
Yeah.
Because I could deport him. But thank you. That was very, very interesting. It was very lovely the way you laid it out, And that's the first time I've ever seen Munkac and Polyana and Tate. I didn't know where these places were. I heard about them, but I never knew where they were.
Well, I have a book that was written by Dr. Moshe Avital, may he rest in peace. He just passed away day after Yom Kippur. He lived in New Rochelle, and he was a friend, and he was next door neighbor to my grandmother, where my grandmother was born in Bielke. And so he researched, and this is where the map came from. And I have more information about my great-grandfather, who was alive in 1944. He was 80 years old. And he's the one, they called him Reb Moshe Blasberg. And people went to advise to him. He was in a leather business. And his children moved around Surlush and Comiat and that area. And they all had business. That's how they made a living.
That's funny, because my mother's maiden name was Solomon. And my great-grandfather used to call King Solomon.
Oh, okay.
I can tell you that we tried to find a map that would, another map besides the two that Erica showed, to give you more details, but the borders changed so often that no matter what I was searching for, I wasn't able to really find enough information to share with you.
Mm-hmm. So can I also mention, like, after we came in 1970 and my girlfriends came in 1980, they waited 12 years to come to this country. So it's not easy. The door's not open to come here, especially, like I said, before the war and right after the war. There's a limit, how many immigrants, I guess, this country accept. But we all here now and happy. And the only thing I forgot to mention is that in the schools in Russia, they did not teach us history of the Holocaust. So growing up, I knew my story from my parents, that how my grandparents were killed and how the whole family, over 90 people of ancestries, grandparents and cousins and all, were murdered. But in the Russian books, they didn't teach us. In the Russian books, they just taught how the Russian partisans and army was fighting with the Germans, and the one who started ending the war. The Russian army had a tremendous loss of life, but they the one who fought the war, and then United States joined in after the Pearl Harbor, and they were part of the liberation and all that. But they weren't teaching, so I didn't connect Second World War when I was learning. 10 years old, I was 10 years old. I didn't connect that the history of my ancestry and my parents and the Second World War was the same thing. Not until I came to this country, and one of my second generation friend, not friend, but an author, Helen Epstein, published the first second generation book where I understood this whole story. I was 21 years old, and that's that. But I am very grateful for the life in this country and free to celebrate, Shabbat. To me, it's very special. I love to have Shabbat table set, candlelight, and whenever I can have the children to come and join us. And we have no shortage of food, thank God.
So I will comment about that education.
Yes.
Here in the United States, I grew up in Bridgeport, went to Central High School, went from there to Boston University, came back here, and there was no teaching. We never got to World War II, never learned about the Holocaust. It wasn't until I started teaching, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, that I knew anything really, really about World War II. The history curriculum, and I know I'm being recorded, but I can tell you firsthand, was poor.
Yeah.
We had no idea, absolutely at all, and it's shameful.
Right. In 1980s, we started here the second generation group, and we started the Yom HaShoah observance at the Jewish Community Center. And then some of the child survivors, like Terry Dworkin was here, and I can't think of this minute the name. Anyway, they started an educational fund, and through Federation, and they were able to sponsor teachers, send them to Israel, to send them to Yad Vashem. I don't remember the name of this person. She was teaching in Monroe. Wonderful person. She taught, the children read the Anne Frank story, and she became so involved that she got a position even at Sacred Heart University to teach about Holocaust. And so she was our first sponsored teacher to travel to Israel and to learn more. And she became a professor. She was teaching then in Ezra, but I can't think of her name.
Well, I went to a number of seminars through the University of Hartford when I was teaching, and through the state. And it was amazing to be at these seminars with teachers who were not Jewish, had no background. And I can tell you that they were appalled at what they heard and definitely committed to teaching what they had learned, which was no different than what I experienced when I went to Whitwell, Tennessee, and saw how they were teaching all about the Holocaust in this town that was probably no bigger than Capitol Avenue, where Rhoda Sholem is, to Main Street. And they were committed, and they did a job that was phenomenal, really phenomenal.
Well, it's
so
really important.
I'm looking for other questions and other comments. People who might have grown up or had family coming from the same area. Anybody else? Jackie.
Well, this isn't exactly my story, but my mother-in-law was born in Hungary, in Fulaj.
Wow.
She had a few things you said a couple weeks ago rang a bell, because by the time I came into the family, this was history. But she did share a lot with me. She came before the war. Her grandparents came, and they begged her father to come. And evidently they were very observant. They had a farm, they were managing okay. And ironically, he didn't want to come. She said he never wanted to come because he was afraid he would not be able to practice his Judaism in the United States. He felt like Hungary was going to protect him. I guess at that point, the Jews had a decent life and they weren't looking to leave so fast.
Right.
So she was the only one who actually came. None of the children wanted to come. She was very brave. Her grandparents were here, an aunt and uncle. And then I guess things got very bad very quickly, and it was too late to get out.
Right.
And after the war, because of the quotas, she had one brother and one sister who survived the concentration camps. I think she sponsored them to come over because it was difficult to get them here. And
Right.
a lot of her cousins also, as Bob said, had to go to Montreal. They couldn't get in. So they went to Montreal and they became very successful builders and, you know, built Jewish areas where they congregated, and his children still live there today, my husband's cousins. So a lot of what you said, I think probably applied to a lot of people who lived in the area at the time.
Thank you, Jackie. Edith, was your family from the same area as Erica's?
No. No, she was from Ville, Hungary. It was a different area, Carol. But can I just mention the history
Wait,
of my,
I'm sorry. Edith, where in Hungary was your family from? Edith, you have to unmute. You're muted.
Town was near Madog. It was a village. The closest big town was Nyíregyháza.
Nyíregyháza.
Was in the state of, in the section called Szabolcs megye.
Yeah. Yeah, that was not too far from the border.
It was the east. That was in the east of Hungary.
Yeah, it wasn't
Closer-
too far.
Closer to the Russian border. My mother came from the Carpathian Mountains, from Košice, that area,
That was Czechoslovakia, yeah.
Czechoslovakia.
Yes, yes, it's similar. I was in Nyíregyháza. We could not travel to Hungary after I was born, after the war. You had to have relatives, like my girlfriends had aunt and cousins, and they would visit Hungary by sending them visa. So I don't remember what year, but I was able to travel by bus from Carpathia to Nyíregyháza and Miskolc, just as a tourist. We went for like a long weekend, 2 or 3 days. But yes, our relatives who came in late 1800 and 1900, because things were very difficult then. Everybody had second marriages, third marriages, and there were children who did not have, where to even sleep from so many large families. So some of them started to come in late 1800. They came to Bridgeport, and they worked. And then my uncle, my aunt's husband, came in 1930, and he worked at a famous American dry cleaning business. And he worked with chemicals, no gloves, worked very hard. He saved up money living here like 4 or 5 years, and he sent the visa for my aunt, Mrs. Lebovitz, and her 2 children, and they were able to get out that way just before the war, late 1938. But you needed a sponsor, and even my cousin Myra's dad, when they came here in 49 or 1950, he still worked the American dry cleaning store. So, during the Depression in 1930s, there weren't that many jobs here either. Things were hard. And, working, my first job I wanted to share with you was I worked in a leather company where Leather Mode, I think was the name of it. Eugene Cohen owned it. He was a friend of our relatives. And, it was an easy job. I steam ironed the leather sewing. And then I worked in a frame shop making picture frames. My experience after I started working 3-4 days after we came to this country, because our uncle sponsored, and so you have to get a job and support yourself. And I got laid off in beginning or mid-December, only working like less than 2 months, and I never heard that word lay off. I was so surprised. It was a new experience. And they said, well, the season is over. They already manufactured everything for winter, and they were closing for like a month or 2 months, the leather business for the winter. And that's when I got the other job. And interesting beginning.
Okay. Nima, your father-in-law's family came from Hungary, correct? Where were they from?
Czechoslovakia. They were from
You're
Czechoslovakia.
muted. You're muted, Nima.
Okay, hello everyone. My father-in-law, Mike Hirsch, came from Munkac. That's where he grew up. He also went to the gymnasium there, the Jewish school, and he studied Hebrew. He loved Hebrew. And so after the war, he went to a DP camp, and from there he ended up in Israel. So he took a different detour, if you will, and also did it much earlier. He arrived on the coast of Israel in 1947, was taken to Cyprus, and really only got to the land of Israel after it declared independence in 1948. So that's really a very, very sketchy summary of my father-in-law.
Yeah. So I went to the business school in the same building where Mike Hirsch studied yeshiva, studied Hebrew. The Russian government took over for everything, businesses, school buildings, synagogues, and converted into, like in Artan, the large homes, the people, Jews who were well-to-do before the war, their homes became hospitals, their homes became schools. And same thing in all the cities. And the government took everything away. Even next door to us lived a family who had a very large home, and 3 of them survived, and they came back. And the government said, this house is too big for you. So they moved in like 2 other families to live within the same area. But life was like in Moscow, when my father started traveling in 1967, 68, 69, in Moscow, people were so poor that when they lived in an apartment building, 6 families shared one kitchen, and they would have just a little electric stove. And they were afraid to even bring in, if they had a piece of meat to cook or chicken or something, because other people who came into the kitchen questioned, where did you get the money? Where did you get the food? That's how life was after the war. And in many ways, still in Russia, things are very difficult. But just to compare how things were, but in Israel also, the relatives who went from DP camps and survived, my aunts, they also shared the kitchen, like 4 or 5 families together. But they were happy to be in Israel, and my uncle Pinchas got wounded in a war of independence. But after that, the 1950s, 60s was very good. They owned businesses and they prospered, just like all the relatives who came here after the war. You know, this country prospered after the war, right? Women started working.
Okay. All right. Any other questions before I wrap it up? Okay, Erica, on behalf of Congregation Road of Shalom and the virtual coffee groupies, I want to thank you for parts 1 and parts 2. I think everybody learned something about the past and the future. Well, the past and the present. The future, we just don't know where we are. I will tell you what's coming next. I asked you all, I was looking for veterans. Road of Shalom has celebrated Veterans Shabbat historically for years. For those of you who know me, you know it's something I started, I believe, deeply in. And Veterans Day happens to be in the middle of the week, not on a Shabbat. So on November 14th, we're going to celebrate Veterans Shabbat, and I will be reaching out to those of you who are veterans, had veterans in your family, and there'll be more to come on that. Our next virtual coffee, based on the calendar, I know it's supposed to be in 2 weeks, is not. It's going to be November 18th, and I will be speaking. My topic will be 55,000 soldiers 16 years later. And you'll find out what that means as we go along. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I
I
don't
have
have
one
to
thing.
tell
Can
you
I,
to drive carefully because of the weather, because you're all home, and it certainly is one miserable day out there. So I'm really glad that we could come together and have a little bit of sunshine to a very dreary day.
can
Erica?
I thank you, Carol? Thank you very much for all your help. And I just want to say on behalf of the synagogue that this is the best country for charity. And I'm so glad to be part of the, to help the hungry in this country. And so our Minion group are preparing food for the homeless. So this is the best country. They care about people. And our synagogue, like I said, prepares food. So thank you so much. And join the charity and help those in need. And thank you again, Carol, and everybody. Thanks, cousins and friends. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Beautiful program. Thank you.
You could say
Köszönöm
something.
szépen. Köszönöm szépen.
Could say it was nice.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you. Bye,
Both.
Betty.
Thank you,
Thank
Carol.
Pleasure.
Everybody.
You'll be
Hey,
hearing
Val.
from me.
We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.